I'm joined today by Army Reserve veteran and J6 prisoner, Tim Hale. He joins us to talk about his prison sentence and the Supreme Court ruling that found Tim and hundreds of others just like him wrongly convicted of obstruction charges in the wake of the January 6, 2021 riots at the Capitol. Thank you for being here, sir. I do appreciate your time and appreciate you joining us on the Federalist Radio Hour.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be with you.
Let me begin here with the writings from my Federalist colleague, Tristan Justice, who wrote the story after the Supreme Court ruling that came down last week. The Supreme Court ruled that the Department of Justice used an inappropriately broad interpretation of federal statute to prosecute a former police officer who was charged because of his involvement in the Capitol riot on January 6, 2021. On Friday, the justices delivered the 6-3 decision in Fisher v. United States, ruling Joseph Fisher should not have been charged with obstruction of an official proceeding under the 2002 Sarbanes-Oxley Act. The statute has been used by the DOJ to charge more than 300 defendants with felonies in the more than 3 years since the riot, with the defendants facing a prison sentence of up to 20 years. Tim Hale, you were one of those 300. Let me get your initial thoughts on what was going through your mind when this ruling came down.
Vindication more than anything. Not everybody was able to fight their cases because they feared the punishment that would come from the trial tax, as it's called, from going to trial to defend against this statute, against this charge. I actually went to trial. I didn't take a plea deal. I didn't get the better end of the deal during that trial, but I'm glad that I was one of the people who fell on a sword fighting that case. I'm very happy with the result of this decision. It was the right decision, and this statute was applied inappropriately for 3 years. I wish I didn't have to lose 3 years of my life, but I'm glad it was for the right cause.
I was going to say, fell on the sword indeed. You were convicted on 4 charges, the obstruction charge as well. That was the felony. That was the big one. That was the one that could have sent you to prison, as we noted, for 20 years. You served the time, so I know it is vindication in your case, but how do you feel about having served the time for that charge when the Supreme Court in a 6-3 ruling says you shouldn't have been charged with that at all?
Well, I'm certainly not happy with it. But I'm more of a stoic person than most. So I kind of had to grin and bear it because I knew I'd win in the long run. But I just kind of had to bear my cross. There's no scenario where I say that I'm happy I lost 3 years of my life. But at the end of the day, I'm happy with my dedication to fighting this case. This all would have been a lot better, this all would have been a lot differently if defendants weren't charged with this in the first place. But I'm not married, I don't have kids, so I didn't have to make maybe as hard a decision as some other defendants. But at a principle, I had to fight my case. And I had to fight that charge. If the DOJ had just given people misdemeanors or tickets like they normally do with leftists, I don't even think this would have made it to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, this is clearly a case that I think a lot of us have looked at, and those who have investigated these cases over the years. There's the political stink all over that. I think that goes without saying. But I mean, you did some hard time as well. And what I mean by that is, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't you have to serve like others in kind of solitary confinement during the COVID years? You had, at points, no contact with family, no contact at one point. I know some didn't have contact with attorneys for a while.
That's correct. And I was one of those, some for all of those. I was in the DC jail because it's called the DC Gulag or DC Gitmo. I was one of the first people in there, and I was in there. I was one of the longest held there. I was put there very early on as well. So as you noted, DC is probably worse than any deep blue state when it came to the COVID restrictions. And that was a Trojan horse for them to strip us of all civil rights. So we were denied due process. We were denied religious services, denied access to our lawyers, denied access to our discovery, our evidence. And yes, we couldn't see our families either. That was a tragedy in and of itself. The conditions in the jail improved after the first year, but the first year, yes, was mostly solitary confinement, 23 hours a day in our cell. There were moments where they, decreased it to 22 hours. But yeah, I mean, the whole thing was a Trojan horse. And, that's another reason we can't fall for these emergency state power situations. Because after a while, frankly, DC stopped with the COVID stuff, but the jail did not. The jail just kept doing it anyway. So yes, it was definitely a hard time. You could even say it was cruel and unusual punishment. You could even say it was tortured. Now, again, I'm a very stoic person, so I could resist it a lot better than some people, perhaps.
Well, Tim, as we know from those who took another critical case before the Supreme Court this year, homeless camping out at public places or not being allowed to do so, that's cruel and unusual punishment according to the left. But these are very strange times in which we live. Take me back to that day, January 6, 2021. There have been a lot of stories written about Tim Hale in particular. And you had argued at your trial, hey, I had no intention of thwarting an election. I was part of, thousands and thousands of people across the country very upset about, what happened during the 2020 election. As I've read the stories, I believe you were of the mind, like many of us, that there certainly were a lot of shenanigans pulled under the cover of COVID, a lot of irregularities and some laws clearly broken. I've investigated that. But tell me what it was like on that day, and how does it differ than the depiction that we've seen in corporate media?
Well, certainly. And yes, I would say irregularities is putting it lightly. The story of the insurrection is completely fraudulent. And I'm sure everybody knows now, years later, of course, but Donald Trump never said to go to the Capitol and riot. He said, go there to peacefully and patriotically protest.
Right.
Part of the reason I think people like me were denied bonds so much was because I think a lot of people had video on their person that would have discounted this narrative. The first things I did after getting out of prison was release the video from my phone showing that people were meandering from the ellipse area to the Capitol. There was no race to get there. This kind of goes against the notion that people had this mindset, this mens rea of obstruction. But even further, you need to understand that there was a perimeter set up that was barely guarded by Capitol Police. And this was breached by gentlemen, including Ray Epps, FBI informant James Knowles. And this happened a half hour before people like me showed up. There were almost like chicken wire fencing that had like rollout fencing that had signs that said no trespassing, restricted area, what have you. And these were literally cut down, rolled up, and moved. So thousands of people poured into an area, not realizing they weren't allowed to be there. And so for about an hour after that, people were still just kind of pouring into the area and just chanting, singing. On my phone, we're singing God Bless America. We're chanting USA. We're chanting Christ is King. And from my perspective, there's no indication at all that there's any violence happening. What you end up having is that through an ocean of people, there are some agitators in the crowd who are basically going back and forth with the Capitol Police. For the most part, it doesn't escalate too far. What actually ends up happening, though, is that the Metro PD show up and they're extremely aggressive. They end up firing flashbang grenades into the middle of the crowd. The crowd is incited. They lash out at the cops. The cops return. And so, or, return fire, so to speak. And so it just becomes this snowball effect. But the average person there had no idea what was happening. The average person there was not violent. The average person there actually thought that they were under attack by the police. And so there was this sense of righteous indignation from the average person who was there when, the cops are body slamming old ladies. And so like they're actually doing this with riot shields. They're slamming into people. They're spraying people for no reason. And when an agitator does get out of hand, and there were a few of them, let there be no mistake about that, they don't necessarily deal with that individual. As I say, they'll throw a flashbang grenade in the middle of a peaceful crowd instead of dealing with the agitators. So a lot of this is heavily coordinated. If you watch the CCTV or the body cameras, you can clearly see that there are actors in the crowd. There were, well, for lack of a better term, I'll use the term crisis actor. But there were plainclothes individuals who blended into the crowd who were trying to hype people up and get them into trouble. I met several of them inside the DC jail. There were federal informants pretty much all over the place. But I'll say this further, inside the Capitol building, once people got away from the excessive force on the outside, people inside the Capitol building were very respectful of the building. People inside the Capitol building were walking through velvet ropes like it was a tour of a museum. There were a couple of people who got out of hand inside the building, but even those people are suspect. Most of the day and most of the people were not out of hand at all. It was absolutely not an insurrection. And it's a complete disservice to the country that the corporate media, as you call it, has basically been replaying the same 30-second clips for 3 years. And this is why there's so much resistance, to releasing the CCTV and all the thousands of hours of video. Not only would it help defendants build their case that they were entrapped or that they were engaging in self-defense or that they just didn't even do what they're accused of, it would also pull the veil over the eyes of the American public. So there's a lot that's been withheld. There's a lot that's been misrepresented. And it's been used for basically a political inquisition.
I agree. I think that's very important. I want to get back to that momentarily. But as you noted, there's no doubt that there were some people in that crowd, and it may be a small percentage, but they were breaking stuff up. They were certainly committing crimes outside of the if you will excuse the turn of phrase, the trumped up Sarbanes-Oxley, the use by this attorney general in the Department of Justice trying to manipulate these sort of charges to execute the maximum damage that they possibly could for their narrative. But did you see, as you were in there, some of the vandalism that indeed was occurring and, some of the aggression that we have seen in those clips? And those are some damning clips.
No, in fact, like most of that, I would say most of the aggression in terms of violence or anything like that, I'd say that was limited to predominantly on the Western Terrace and especially in an area you would call the Lower West Terrace Tunnel. And there's an element to that area I think was kind of a sort of a trap or a photo op. A lot of that, of course, I'm sure you've heard the story of Roseanne Boyland. There were a lot of people who were effectively trying to, defend people that they saw being injured or who they thought were under attack. Mm-hmm. But as I said, inside the building, in terms of vandalism, the closest thing I saw to vandalism inside the building was people had put like Trump flags in the hands of statues, or they put like a MAGA hat on a statue. I actually was looking. I mean, that's basically what I spent most of my time doing inside the Capitol, inside an area called the Crypt. The Crypt is a circular room, a large room with a bunch of statues. So people were just posing with statues and taking pictures. It was kind of like dorky, actually. It was not in any way. It was not in any way as egregious as the media would like to portray. And matter of fact, there were people picking up garbage. Actually, the Capitol Police had left a bunch of trash in Crypt Lobby East. And then it was actually protesters when they came in the area. You can actually watch on the CCTV as they collect the trash and put it in garbage bags. Not everybody disrespected the so-called temple of democracy. Quite the contrary. People were in awe, and I could say myself as well, seeing the statues, the architecture. It was the people's house, and I think people more or less treated it as such. I think it was a very complex day, and there were a lot of moving pieces. So I would say not every civilian, not everybody in the crowds was a good person. Not every person in the crowds was a bad one. Not every officer that day was a monster, but not every officer that day was doing their job appropriately. And so I think it's a very complicated day. And I think that's why they go for the simple narratives, because people tend to latch on to simple narratives. But I do think that if you examine it holistically, then you come away seeing that this was really not at all what it was portrayed as.
Government intervention has ruined yet another industry. The Watchdog on Wall Street podcast with Chris Markowski. Every day, Chris helps unpack the connection between politics and the economy and how it affects your wallet. After Seattle imposed a minimum wage for delivery drivers, customers, drivers, and restaurants saw less orders and longer wait times. When government messes with the free market, it fails every single time. Whether it's happening in D.C. or down on Wall Street, it's affecting you financially. Be informed. Check out the Watchdog on Wall Street podcast with Chris Markowski on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast.
Whether you're planning a barbecue, hitting the beach, or just soaking up the sun, make your summer unforgettable at BetMGM. Looking for some hot thrills? Well then, get ready to dive into the excitement this June with Shark Week Jaws of Steel. During the month of June, spin our Shark Week Jaws of Steel slot and sink your teeth into a daily prize up to $4,000. Play every day during the promotional period for even more chances to win big. Your summer fun is just a spin away with BetMGM's hottest promotion. Download the BetMGM Casino app today and turn your summer into a season of excitement and rewards. Visit BetMGM.com for terms and conditions. 21 years of age or older to wager, New Jersey only. All promotions are subject to qualification and eligibility requirements. Rewards issued as non-withdrawable site credit unless otherwise provided in the applicable terms. Rewards subject to expiry. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Again, that's 1-800-GAMBLER.
Well, and there is this point. If it is what they say it is, that is the Biden administration, Democrats in this country campaigning on J6, the J6 committee, which now, of course, as we learn more and more just how politically driven this, this sham of an investigative committee was, led by liberal politicians in Washington, D.C., with a clear motive involved here. But if they didn't have anything to hide, they would release all of the footage. They would not have destroyed evidence. And yet nobody in, like I said, the accomplice or corporate media seems to be all that concerned about it. When you have testified in court, when you are saying to us now, and you've said repeatedly as much as you could over the last several years, hey, what they're telling you happened did not happen. In fact, full video will show you that. Why do you think we have all of these government officials, particularly the Department of Justice, opting to keep this information from the public?
So this is a doozy. So bear with me here. Mentioning Sarbanes-Oxley, the original statute for 1512, of course, was just, tampering with a witness, and it went back to the 80s. But, that sub-statute of 1512 we'd all been charged with, that was added in 2003 after the Enron scandal. And what's very interesting is that the first judge to uphold 1512 for J6 defendants was Dabney Friedrich. And her husband was actually on the Enron task force. So there's a conflict of interest there that I don't feel was ever fully investigated appropriately as to why she didn't recuse herself or what have you. But further than that, and this is, take this as anecdotal evidence, but I do have the signatures of my fellow inmates from the jail on this matter. The first defendants to have 1512 upheld were federal informants. So Nathan DeGrave, Ronald Sandlin, and Josiah Colt, 3 co-defendants, were there to get out of trouble with the feds. For instance, one of them, DeGrave, had actually been caught in a drug conspiracy in 2020, and his co-defendant Sandlin had admitted as much. So it's a little suspicious that the first defendants to have 1512 upheld were federal informants. And then you have the connection to their judge, to the task force itself. There seems like there's a lot that could easily point to this being basically coordinated, specifically not just for, January 6th defendants, but really a long game for them to go after President Trump. So they could not only get away with January 6th and, sabotaging his supporters there and sabotaging the claims against the election being rigged in 2020, but also as a long-term plan to sabotage any attempt to run in 2024. So I do think this is ultimately a narrative that's meant to sabotage the political aspirations of an extremely popular political figure. But I also think in the long run, this is just, as you've alluded to, this charge is really a way to. It was really a way to basically pull plea deals and confessions out of defendants because they feared, as you said, a 20-year sentence. Now, few people have actually gotten that 20-year sentence, but a lot of people have had sentences that were excessive, exorbitant compared to what they ought to have had. Like in my instance, I got over twice my sentencing guidelines with a 4-year sentence when I was calculated at only 21 months. The 1512 charge has been used along with a grab bag of misdemeanors and other nonsense, as well as enhancements and terrorism enhancements and all that. It's really just been it's been a way to target Trump supporters. And I think part of it is really just to scare people, not just from January 6th, but in general. I think it's a way to scare middle America and to keep them from ever taking a stand on pretty much anything. I think it's a way to pacify the public and to normalize election fraud and to normalize basically the submission of the people like myself who were in the military, or in the case of Fisher, a police officer. I think it's a way to pacify the people who actually make the country function, to just make them go along with the machinations of the power structure without standing with the people they swear an oath to, which is not the people in power, but actually the public. So I think there's a lot they've invested in this. I think the reason they're still doing it, even though nobody even believes this anymore, the insurrection narrative, I think they're still going with it because it's pretty much all they have. I think they put all their eggs in one basket. You could say they're going to run on abortion or what have you. Like, okay, maybe, but I think the insurrection narrative, or Trump supporters are anti-democracy broadly, I think that's all they have. And so I think I think that's pretty much it.
I think there's a lot of truth to that, especially after the recent debate, the debacle of Joe Biden, and the nation and the world. For the first time, millions of people seeing the deterioration mentally, cognitively, physically of the president of the United States, the octogenarian president of the United States. Yes, exactly. So I think that, and it's interesting because you look at the decision, the 6-3 decision, you will see justices who say that the use of Sarbanes-Oxley, and that's what it's really all about, is that was an injustice for anybody who values the rule of law in this country. That's the Department of Justice, federal prosecutors going way too far, as they did throughout this entire case, this entire investigation, in pursuit of naked political, narratives out there. And these are the people who claim to be the defenders of democracy. It doesn't square when you take a look at the full body of evidence. We are talking to Tim Hale, Army Reserve veteran, J6 prisoner, on this edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. Tim, you are well-spoken. You're a bright guy. So this is what I do not understand. When you testified, you said, and I can understand this, that you were not there for an insurrection. You were not there for any of the sort of things that, it's been painted by the Department of Justice, by federal prosecutors, and by the corporate media. That said, you didn't know, according to testimony, that Congress was where the official business was taking place. I have a difficult time believing that. How could that be?
Well, just to clarify, I never said I didn't know Congress was debating the issue. What I actually was arguing was that I literally did not know what building I was in. I was not familiar with DC, and I largely followed the crowd that was in front of me. So actually, I just genuinely did not actually know where I was walking to. And so I understand, but that's interesting to me. But you have in the course of this conversation, sure. I mean, you have described in great detail the building that you didn't know you were in. Right. And that is, of course, retroactive. Mm-hmm. Keep in mind, I was following the crowd all the way from the Ellipse, and I had actually gone several days without sleep. I had been sprayed. I had flashbangs go off around me. I believe I was hit in the head, and I actually think I had a concussion. I had lost my hearing from flashbangs that the cops were lobbing at the crowd. And I mean, there's no denying also, there was almost a state of euphoria and from the adrenaline and all that. There were a lot of things going through my head, and I'm potentially interfering with a congressional hearing was absolutely not part of it. There was never one point where I was looking for anything in particular. If you watch the CCTV, for instance, and this applies to a lot of people genuinely didn't know what to do. So when I enter the building initially, I go to the right and I follow people down a hallway. And then I turn to the left and follow different people down back to the original hallway and down another hallway. And then I turn back right. I actually did not know what to do, where I was, or what was even going on. And eventually, when I actually met the Capitol Police in the Capitol Visitor Center, and they explained where I was and what the situation was, I followed them out of the building. They escorted us back out to where we initially came into. So, I mean, it might sound absurd, but two things can be true at the same time. I can be eloquent or well-read about, say, proceedings of the state or what have you, and just due to not being a native of the area and just not knowing the actual architecture and all that, I just genuinely didn't know what was going on. I was kind of lost. And as I said, I worked overnights. I was a naval weapons contractor, and I'd actually gone several days without sleep. So it's a miracle I actually made it there without getting into an accident.
It's about a four-hour trip from where you were.
On top of days without sleep, also I was also the union rep, so I was always working even when I was off duty. And the only reason I even made it to DC in one piece was because I pounded a bunch of Bang energy drinks. So that's really what kept me going.
Well, the prosecutors and the press, of course, had they spent a lot of ink and a lot of energy trying to paint a picture here, and they did this of you. And I want to get your reaction to this. This is from National Public Radio. By the way, taxpayer-funded National Public Radio, so you, the taxpayer, are paying for the narrative that NPR is shaping, and that narrative is generally, most always, the left-wing narrative. But this is from the story on the day that you were convicted. Prosecutors portrayed Timothy Hale of New Jersey as an extremist who hoped for a second civil war. The government presented evidence of Hale using racist, anti-Semitic, and anti-gay slurs, yelling obscenities at officers protecting the Capitol, and later enthusiastically boasting about breaching the building to a roommate. As jurors heard at trial, that roommate was secretly wearing a recording device on behalf of investigators with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS, and the FBI. Tell me about that descriptor. Does that fairly represent you?
I'm going to say things that never happened for 500, Alex. No, so basically they had this narrative, and I'll say this narrative about me was probably assembled piecemeal. Initially, I think they were going with the Civil War stuff to try to portray me as sort of a Timothy McVeigh type character. And then gradually, I think they moved more towards the racial extremist or what have you. So no, basically, as I alluded to, I was the union rep for the contractors that I worked with. And I had a not good relationship with the management there. So one of the first things that happened when I got back from January 6th is I actually went back to work that very night, and whatever, but management actually had tipped off the feds that I was there. And so NCIS, which of course I was on a Navy base, so NCIS had my roommate wear a wire. And basically my roommate had tried to get me to say incriminating things to make me look as bad as possible while I was drinking. And so anybody who knows me knows I'm a bit of a smart guy. So I say a lot of things. And so what ended up happening was they took a lot of things that were on a recording completely out of context, and they actually used that to deny me bail.
Did they edit those recordings to make it look worse than it was?
Actually, yes. And one of the ways they did this was actually just by not even providing the transcripts. So they chopped up the transcripts to make it look like I was planning a civil war. But the full recording shows that I actually, instead of doubling down, I did the exact opposite. I walked it completely back and say, yeah, no, I don't want that. And it didn't matter. That didn't come out for months. And so here I am telling my public defender, like, yo, you got to get the full thing, because I literally say the exact opposite. It didn't matter. The public defender didn't want to do anything on my behalf. The public defender's office were actually working with the prosecution. They actually would brag that they were friends with them. This is why basically nobody had a chance in DC with the public defender's office. And so, yeah, I mean, I was completely. Now, keep in mind, my roommate of 3 years, who was a friend of mine, he was a Jamaican man. He's a black guy. So, I mean, I don't know many. I don't know many white supremacists who cohabitate with African Americans. And keep in mind, I was the union rep for the contractors I worked at. I had to be elected by them, and over half of them were Black, Asian, and Hispanic. Myself, and Puerto Rican. None of it made sense, but it didn't matter. At the end of the day, they had their narrative, and it was bad enough I was going in front of a DC jury, but they had to prejudice the jury even further with the far right nutjob narrative. And keep in mind also, it didn't end with my roommate. As I alluded to, there were informants inside the DC jail, and those NPR articles you just read, who do you think planted a lot of the narratives for that? They put informants in the jail to sabotage my case. I'd say actually about a third of the inmates I was with, I mean, we'll say roughly a third, were actually sending supposed evidence to NPR to sabotage my case. These articles largely came out before my trial, and they were even cited by my prosecutors at my sentencing hearing. So you actually had one individual, Tom Civic, who tried to get me to endorse another Oklahoma City bombing. I mentioned the McVeigh thing. They were actually trying to go with that. They were trying to say I was inspired by him. So, I mean, there's a lot that went on behind the scenes, but if you want to call it the DC gulag or what have you, you need to recognize gulags don't just work with oppressor and oppressed. There are always collaborators. And that was true, too, for the January 6th situation. There were a lot of people who were planted in there to sell us out, and they did.
Whether you're planning a barbecue, hitting the beach, or just soaking up the sun, make your summer unforgettable at BetMGM. Looking for some hot thrills? Well, then get ready to dive into the excitement this June with Shark Week Jaws of Steel. During the month of June, spin our Shark Week Jaws of Steel slot and sink your teeth into a daily prize up to $4,000. Play every day during the promotional period for even more chances to win big. Your summer fun is just a spin away with BetMGM's hottest promotion. Download the BetMGM Casino app today and turn your summer into a season of excitement and rewards. Visit BetMGM.com for terms and conditions. 21 years of age or older to wager, New Jersey only. All promotions are subject to qualification and eligibility requirements. Rewards issued as non-withdrawable site credit unless otherwise provided in the applicable terms. Rewards subject to expiry. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Again, that's 1-800-GAMBLER.
This year, thousands of New Jersey homeowners will lose their homes. You don't have to be one of them. If you are falling behind, contact the New Jersey courts to learn more about your options. Call 609-421-6100. That's 609-421-6100.
From the beginning, of course, with all of the political overtones, Tim, this wasn't described as the BLM protests were described in 2020 as a peaceful protest. Now, certainly there were moments and times, and there were people involved that were indeed rioting at the Capitol on January 6, 2021. But have you looked at the comparisons? I'm sure you have thought about that over the last few years. Looked at how the Marxist Black Lives Matter protest riots and in covering some of those events in places like Kenosha, Wisconsin, I can tell you that it was more than a riot. Is it difficult to square how those riots were covered versus what happened on January 6, 2021?
Well, mostly peaceful protests. It's actually extremely important, I think, not just for defendants. I think for if you want to call it the right or what have you, in arguing about this sort of thing going forward, it's really important to mention that, but not for the reason you might think. I remember very often after January 6th, you'd often hear on radio or TV or what have you is, well, yeah, J6 was bad, but what about Antifa? What about BLM? What about Antifa? What about BLM? And that's true. But here's the real issue is that the disparate treatment is actually the issue at hand here. Yes, they're leftists and they're radicals and, they're violent monsters and all that. But, one of the arguments that I had to really pull together as a defendant was this issue of selective prosecution, as well as frankly, it goes back to the 14th Amendment. And so we typically think of the 14th Amendment and equal protection and due process as really just a civil rights era extension of the Fifth Amendment to the states. But in reality, there's a lot more to it that the common law system is kind of, is really expanded. And so it's like you actually have protections for racial, religious, and indeed even political dissident status that were kind of thrown out the window. So if you go back to the Yick Wo case, you had Asians in, say, California that were being prosecuted for legitimate statutes, but they were being targeted because they were Asian. Mm-hmm. And so there was a disparate treatment in that community versus other citizens. And so there are times when statutes are legitimate. Let's assume 1512 was, and it's not, but let's assume it was, to be as charitable as possible. It is when the law is applied with, quote, an evil eye and an uneven hand. That's when you have selective prosecution. That's when you have malicious prosecution. That's when you have a violation of equal protection under the law. And so when Trump supporters are being hunted down and targeted as insurrectionists or terrorists, it's a far cry from the way that Antifa, BLM, and others have been treated. And so here's an interesting observation. When we were in the DC jail, there were riots going on in DC from environmental protesters, and they were ramming bike racks into police. And I think they got tickets, if that. As you alluded to, there were BLM riots in Washington, D.C. actually before January 6th, the summer before, I believe. And so when you look at, say, Antifa burning the federal courthouses in the Portland riots, it's one thing to say, well, just because someone does something bad doesn't mean you get to get away with doing something bad as well. That's not really the argument. The argument is that justice is supposed to be blind. And so the argument is supposed to be that it should be fairly, justice should be distributed fairly. And so I think this is an argument that the right, or what have you, should really examine. There is a constitutional process here as well. There's a constitutional issue. It's not just the poor treatment in the jail, though that's bad. There are all sorts of constitutional violations in this. Yes, we had the Bill of Rights basically stripped from us, but even further than the Bill of Rights is the 14th Amendment. And so you're going to see basically the breakdown of not just due process, but also equal protection. You're going to see the breakdown of civil rights in America, and you're going to see a breakdown of our common law system. What this prosecution has done is demonstrate that people with power will no longer respect the fair treatment of all American citizens. The law system, the lawfare as it's called, is being used to target political dissidents. And that's just as bad as if people were being targeted for ethnic or religious differences. That's what our system says. Yeah, and right. I think that's what people should really focus on. You're absolutely right. There's been a very different way. We've been treated very differently than even, by the way, it doesn't have to be violence. Even Code Pink interrupted senatorial hearings, or interrupted confirmation hearings in the Senate buildings. So, I mean, this is something.
Congressman Bowman.
Well, there you go.
I mean, the fire alarm. That's the most, maybe one of the more egregious examples. But you're right. I mean, when you talk about burning down government buildings in Portland, isn't that an insurrection? But you see, the difference was you had an accomplice media painting the very violent demonstrations that were going on with BLM, not as an insurrection, not as a precursor to a civil war, but as righteous indignation. And as you told me before, and as you've discussed in many different forums, there were a lot of people who were experiencing righteous indignation post-November 2020. When they believed that the election was stolen from them. So they were assembled to protest that. They weren't necessarily assembled to overthrow the government, but that is how it was painted. I just have a moment left. I want to ask you, what's next for Tim Hale? Because, you have spent the last 4 years in this country, three plus years in this country, basically living under the shadow of a particular narrative. You spent a lot of time in prison for, once again, at least one of the crimes, according to the Supreme Court, you should not have been convicted of. What's next for you?
Well, it's kind of a morbid observation, but I actually got off lucky, I suppose, compared to a lot of my friends who I met inside the jail. And so I still have friends who are rotting in prison, and they have sentences of 5, 6, 8, 10, 12, even 14 years. And so I can't really forget about them. So, yeah, I mean, there are these smaller questions of how long it's going to take for me to get off probation. How long is it going to take to get resentenced over 1512? Yeah, these are minor details. I think in the long run, my main mission is going to be advocating for the men who don't deserve to be rotting away, but who still are. So, my family founded Patriot Freedom Project, which is basically a charity that essentially it helps pay bills and support families of January 6th defendants who, of course, most of them were the breadwinners of the family. And so, or even helping with legal fees. So basically, I think that going forward, I'm going to mainly work on helping the families and doing whatever I can to advocate for those people. Donald Trump has even endorsed Patriot Freedom Project. You can go to patriotfreedomproject.com if anybody wants to help support the families. And I hate to be that guy. This isn't Chicken Little. It's not going to get better. Because while the 1512 being tossed is a good thing, the government's bragging that they're going to prosecute another 1,000 people before this election. They've already gotten 1,400. So the need to help these families is not going to go away anytime soon. So I guess my main mission right now is just talking about all this, not just the 1512, talking about the solitary, talking about the men who've been framed, talking about the people who set us up, talking about all this. So I very much appreciate that you had me on here. I very much appreciate you sitting down with me and being willing to have this back and forth. It's very important because for the longest time, Americans believed the narrative. For the longest time, nobody cared about us as we languished behind bars. And for the longest time, people didn't even know half of what they know today. And so it's extremely important that I, and pretty much anyone who can, continues to speak out about this. So I thank you very much for having me on. Those who are willing to help the families, please do. And, please say prayers, not just for all the defendants and their families. Please also say prayers for President Trump and pray for our country, because I don't know if it's ever been this bad before. So thank you.
Yeah, well, I very much appreciate your time. Your story is harrowing, and a lot of folks who have similar stories, harrowing. The problem in this country right now, where we are at in this country, is that a lot of Americans, maybe they weren't paying attention. They have lives of their own to lead. Maybe they weren't all that interested, but they've suddenly awakened to the fact that Joe Biden is not the Joe Biden that the accomplice media has depicted for the last several years. They're coming to terms with that. My hope is that they're going to start questioning then all of the other stuff that has been sold to them, packaged to them, and the whole J6 experience is top of that list. I very much appreciate those like yourself willing to fight against the narrative. And one day I do believe there will be the full truth coming out. Whether anyone will truly be held accountable, that truly remains to be seen. Thanks to my guest today, Army Reserve veteran and J6 prisoner, Tim Hale. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Matt Kittle, senior correspondent at the Federalist. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, stay lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.